disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest. Do it now.
A boss ain't nothing but a thief on a time loan. 128-bit war, you play Nintendo. On some shooter, so put the bridge down. Don't feed us to the killer bees. We get what we deserve. Like bury me with my MP3s. Write my manifesto in 72 DPI. Life's just a game. You got cheated, never learn. I write these songs for every bridge that ain't been burned. For every cop car that ain't been turned.
Welcome to This is America, March 25th, 2022. On today's episode, first we speak with somebody involved in the recent occupation of a university in so-called Montreal. We then present an interview with several folks in Merced, California, who are supporting an ongoing hunger strike in several local jails. We then turn towards our discussion, where we look at what is driving high gas prices and how it is connected to war profiteering and the ongoing Russian invasion of the Ukraine. All this and more, but first, let's get to the news. Amazon workers at different facilities across two different states organized a walkout to demand a $3 raise. Resistance to anti-LGBTQ bills and attacks on trans and queer people continue across the U.S. Last week in Rhode Island, students across several high schools walked out against proposed pieces of legislation. This week in Idaho, students rallied against anti-LGBTQ bills at the state capitol. Meanwhile in Iowa, around 100 students from two different high schools marched out of their school and held a rally in a park. At the University of North Texas in Denton, over 100 people mobilized against a group of self-described Christian fascists who were scheduled to hold an event featuring a speaker connected to the white nationalist Groyper movement. The speaker ended up being ironically canceled, and only about 30 people attended a meeting by the group on campus, while a much larger crowd rallied outside and protested. The rally was only the latest in a string of ongoing actions, walkouts, and protests against the presence of far-right activists on campus linked to neo-Nazis and white nationalists. In other student news, at Adena High School in Minnesota, students walked out and marched against the surfacing of a racist video. Students in Seattle also walked out in protest of the state ending mask mandates. As the Seattle Times wrote, the newly formed Seattle Student Union, a group of student activists that organized the rally, have been demanding stronger safety protocols since January, including district-issued high-quality masks. The group has been threatening a walkout since the governor announced plans to end mask requirements in schools. One student said, "Every time we try to get hasty and toss our mask out, you have another spike and another 1,000 people die." Meanwhile, in so-called Minneapolis, in solidarity with teachers who have been on strike for 2 weeks, students occupied the administration building for Minneapolis Public Schools, calling for striking teachers' demands to be met, as Unicorn Riot reported. Students said they have been occupying the admin building because they were tired of the district using the media to say that teachers are taking advantage of students and using them. Resistance against the development of Cop City continues in the Atlanta forest. A new communique posted to Scenes from the Atlanta Forest reads, "Last week we sabotaged 6 earth-destroying machines, including 2 large excavators and a bulldozer, at a Reeves Young construction site in Flowery Branch, Georgia. We do not need more training centers for the police to practice killing us. We do not need more Amazon warehouses for 2-hour delivery of fleshlights and Quest bars. What we need is what we already have. What Reeve Young aims to ruin, spaces free from empire, soil, roots and water, mutually healing, trees bending in the wind, a friend's eyes shining in the light of the fire. We will not rest, so neither will our enemies. In solidarity with all those locked in cages, in solidarity with all those combating Russian and American imperialism, let us strike without fear at everything which confines and assails us. May the flame that burns inside us burn everything around us." In the Bronx, people took to the streets against the police after an 18-year-old, Luis Montesano, was shot in the head and hospitalized after law enforcement opened fire into a moving car. Finally, in Los Angeles, California, protesters have been disrupting mayoral debates in protest of the city's ongoing attacks on the houseless and rising police brutality. As Sam Levin recently reported in The Guardian, a year after the violent mass eviction of Echo Park, the vast majority of those displaced still remain on the street, despite promises made from politicians to find housing. On a positive note, a group called the Crosswalk Collective is installing DIY crosswalks to make the streets safer for pedestrians and bicycles. On the group's Twitter, they stated, "The city doesn't keep us safe, so we keep us safe. Till the City Council acts, we paint crosswalks. Their Twitter account also includes a link to a request for a crosswalk. And now for some upcoming events. On March 26th, the Phoenix Anarchist Federation will be hosting several workshops. On April 9th, the San Antonio Anarchist Book Fair is happening. On May 8th through 15th, there's a call for a week of action to defend the Atlanta forest. On June 5th, the Bay Area Anarchist Book Fair is going down in Oakland, California. And August 13th through the 21st, the Institute for Advanced Troublemaking is hosting 18 days of popular education, blending theory and practice for people of all ages. Check our show notes for more information on all of these events. And finally, if you value itsgoingdown.org as a revolutionary autonomous media resource in times of crisis and you have the means, please go to itsgoingdown.org/shop. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop and sign up to donate monthly or give us a one-time donation. You can also follow our RSS feed so you never miss a podcast. Check us out on the radio on Fridays on kpfa.org. Follow us on all social media accounts like Twitter, Instagram, and Mastodon. Tell a friend about us, and if you like this show, check out other amazing content on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. That's going to do it for us this week. Please enjoy the interviews and the discussion, and we will see you soon.
My name is Leroy. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling from Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal, just outside of an occupation that's been going on at McGill for now 10 days.
Walk us through how this happened and why is it going on?
Yeah, it's a few things. For a while, Montreal's had a sort of climate movement that I think has been discontent with its own tactics that it's been using. We had a huge protest back in 2019 where we had 500,000 people take the streets during, I think it was September 27th. And it was probably the largest climate march. Some faculties or student associations went on strike for the day, And we've done sort of protests like that very similarly. And I think we're realizing they definitely have their limitations if they're effective at all. So we have a climate group that's been going on at McGill since 2012. So it's 10 years old now. The goal of that group, it's called Divest McGill. The goal of it is to get the university to drop its $50 million in fossil fuel investments, as well as two other goals, which is to broadly educate the McGill population on ecological issues and to also express solidarity with people most adversely affected by climate change, particularly Indigenous people and people of color. We have had, just like I think the general climate movement in Montreal, a huge difficulty with using classically like liberal tactics. We've done a lot of protests, brief sit-ins in the university administration building, diploma returns, stuff like that to try to get the university to drop its fossil fuel investments. The issue is, just like many parts of our society, we don't control the university. It's primarily controlled by people who are unelected and come from the corporate class. There are 8 of 25 members who are directly elected by some constituency. The rest are appointed and tend to come from corporations. So we have, for instance, CEOs and members of the board of governors of some of the biggest banks in Canada, including HSBC Bank, BMO, and the National Bank of Canada, who sit on our board. We have at least one billionaire, real estate mogul, the person who looks over the investments and decides whether or not to drop them or not, and who usually calls the shots on those matters, worked for Petro-Canada as an executive for over 15 years. So we were definitely hitting a lot of walls, and that's where the idea of an occupation sort of came up. And I think starting last year, that's definitely when our numbers in terms of anarchist presence in the group also started to increase. As for the occupation itself, the idea was to have sort of a community building tactic to avoid making demands. We came out pretty early saying that within our group, when we were planning it, that we would not be making demands with this and that we would no longer be at all legitimizing the decision-making authority of the board that runs McGill University. So we would just be trying to create an insurrectionary atmosphere on campus to build up to something like a strike. And in order to do that, yeah, we needed to build our community. We needed to show people what disobedience looked like and to start practicing it ourselves. And we needed to have a space in which we could have continued conversations about the future of the student movement at McGill. Because at the moment, no one has all the answers. And I think we felt we needed those, like, what has now been like over 100 hours, probably over 200 hours of just like being in the same room, like literally being in the same hallway with each other, teaching each other, talking to each other. It's also been great in terms of, and this was the idea in terms of, having something public where we could connect to people who might not have heard about our group, and who would be drawn to something like an occupation, specifically people who are, like activists or want to be activists, or people who are radicals.
The write-up that you all put out, that's on It's Going Down and a couple other websites, mentioned the student strike in 2012, which is now 10 years old. Talk about how that experience still looms large kind of in the popular imagination of people, and why that's something that you are continuously referencing and building inspiration from.
Yeah, 2012 was, in the history of the world, the biggest student strike. It had at its height over 300,000 students on strike. It went on for over 3 months. The student union, which was most active in the strike and really organizing it, can roughly be called anarcho-syndicalist, and that was definitely in the idea when it was formed. It ended up being super effective. Well, I don't know if you can call it super effective, but it definitely ended up defeating the 75% tuition hike. It forced the government to call an election, which it eventually lost. New practices of agitation were shown on the streets. People were fighting the cops. People were chasing the cops. Like, there were points at which the numbers of students on the streets were greater and more threatening than the police. And we could actually fight the police and win. So a lot of police were actually taking time off of work at the time because they were afraid of being in the streets. Generally, it was like massive resistance to capitalism, extractivism, also patriarchy. It also formed like a unique social and cultural atmosphere. Other than that, you see still a lot of people who were in 2012 active in the movement today, and they tend to be some of the most active people. So it was, I guess you could call it educational as an experience, also radicalizing as an experience. It definitely was a growing point for the anarchist movement here in Tiohtià:ke, or so-called Montreal. So it's the 10th anniversary this year. There will be a protest for free education happening soon. There was, of course, the March 15th anti-police brutality protest. And our camp itself, we are wearing a red circle. The symbol at the time of 2012 was the red square, and the red circle sort of merges the red square with the green circle that was being worn during the climate strikes. We also have a lot of people who were in 2012 lending solidarity in different ways. I'll say that.
You mentioned the climate strikes. Kind of curious your thoughts looking back on that, and just kind of that specter of that now. I mean, nothing has changed. Things have just gotten worse. I mean, the new IPCC report that just came out is just as bad as ever.
It's almost been an unfortunate or harmful tactic in some ways, because it has gotten a lot of people disenchanted with the notion of what a strike means. I think a lot of people just want to strike for a day, as largely a symbolic thing, to let people, also as a bit of an excuse to let people go to these protests. It has, discouraged people's view of what collective action can mean. I think a lot of people, but it's been good insofar as that, like, a lot of people realize that these protests and these strikes aren't enough, and are asking, like, what more has to be done. And generally, this is McGill specific, which tends to have a more liberal campus. I think you'd find maybe more answers at like other campuses like UQAM, which is much more radical. But yeah, at McGill, people are sort of, I think, a little ambiguous as to what really we need to do outside of these like one-day strikes, these big protests. And generally, I think for me at least, and many of the anarchists who are right now in the occupied zone at McGill, the answer is we need to like build an insurrectionary community at McGill. We need to constantly be capable of resisting effectively the university through direct action. And we also need to have more democratic structures within our student unions, so that we actually have a student union based on like direct democracy as is dominant in many francophone universities and CEGEPs. One thing you see here recently in so-called Montreal is a lot of productive window smashing that's been going on by what I suppose to be anarchists who have been targeting the windows of the major financiers of different pipeline projects. That seems to be some of the most effective work being done right now, as well as blocking of the railroads in support of shut down Canada in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. One thing I'd say though is that the occupation right now isn't just targeting, it's not just sort of a climate change centered occupation. We definitely take issue with the university's relationship to colonialism, its relationship to capitalist methods of production, as well as its state-centered approach to education, and therefore it's a sort of lack of internal democracy. And in that view, I think we see that we definitely need to not be single issue about fighting against climate change. I think, as a lot of like decolonial activists are saying, but also I think as a lot of anarchists are saying, like, we need to there's larger systems at play here which have been allowing climate ruin.
Well, what kind of things are you doing to engage other people on campus during this occupation?
Totally. So we have free food. People can eat there. Breakfast for free, lunch for free, and supper for free. Those are all being provided by, we have some groups doing dumpster diving for us. We have several food collectives which are providing food for us. We really haven't had to worry too much about food. Otherwise, we have a zine table, which a lot of radicals have been coming in, just dropping off zines that people can take. A lot of stuff from 2012 and from like reflections by anarchists who were in 2012, including, oh God, I forget the name of the something like Blockade, Occupy, and Strike Back or something like that, which circulated in the tens of thousands during 2012, and which sort of just tells you how to blockade yourself in an occupied space. So that's the zine table. People have really taken to it. I think we've handed out well over 1,000 zines. Definitely, we've been to the printers almost every day, printing out over 200 different kinds of zines or leaflets and stuff like that. Otherwise, we have activities. We've had we started off with some reading circles. Last week, we did a reading circle on education in Zapatista territory, how that works. That was well attended. probably about 15 people. You often get like a mix of people who are very active in the space and people who are just coming in for the activities from outside. And those activities are advertised online and by flyer. We've also started a bit of a sort of mailing list so we can email blast our activities. Just now we finished a discussion and a reading group on revolutionary education in South and East Turkey among the Kurdish population there. Otherwise, we've done like different discussions on different topics. We did a discussion on anarchism, which had about 25 people attend. We did a discussion on democratic education, which was given by someone doing a PhD on anarchist pedagogy. Otherwise, we did a screening of 2012. We were thinking of doing a screening of Shrek 2, and we have done a screening also on the revolution in Rojava. So it's, film screenings, discussions, reading groups, sort of workshops. We did a nice workshop on having one-on-one discussions and using one-on-ones in our organizing. Otherwise, we have assemblies twice a day usually, once in the morning and once at night. We discuss which tasks need taken on, and we also discuss where this occupation is going exactly and where our student movement is going. Today, actually, we have scheduled at 7:30 an assembly where we will go over some things we went over in an assembly last week, which had 60 or 70 people in it, which was the democratization of the university and how we approach that and how we can fight for that. Otherwise, we discuss things like what escalatory actions are we taking next in those kinds of spaces.
Why is it important to have that kind of push to like democratize this institution that's like, as you were saying, like so tied to fossil fuels and the corporate world?
It's a bit of a contradiction that I think our activists are talking a lot about. At the one time, we definitely do. I think some of us, I can't speak for everyone, but definitely some of us want to sort of abolish the university as we know it, because its education is very much geared towards producing professionals who work in the for-profit sector, providing a space where public money can fuel the training of people for corporations. So like at McGill, for instance, we have a mining engineering faculty, which trains people literally to go work in the fossil fuel industry, and which gives people internships for major Canadian fossil fuel corporations like Suncor. Otherwise, of course, we have the faculty of management, the faculty of law, other such faculties. And otherwise, I think we're very critical of the fact that universities, just as they have been framed, are very much designed in a hierarchical fashion, which seems like it cannot be mediated. There's the professor who earns a very high salary and who takes a very much elite status within the university. And then there's the student worker who isn't even recognized as a worker, pays to be there, and is expected to put out as much work for as little thanks as possible. Work that it doesn't often provide any social utility, but it's just sort of papers which are read by the professor and graded. And these courses that people take go on for several years and are very general, induce many mental health issues that many people struggle with. It is like we do very much have an almost unmediatable catastrophe, which is the university. That said, it is a place, I think, of power. There a lot of student movements, such as 2012, have been within the university, as well as movements like May 68. I do think these are places we can try to take over. Of course, through direct action, not through like running people in elections or anything like that. And I do think we need to, the framing of the university as something which can be controlled by staff and students as we're putting forward, and not by people who, not hierarchically by staff and students, and not by people who sort of occupy an elite status or who come from the corporate world. I think that's a compelling narrative, and I think it definitely puts into perspective how a lot of our institutions, like corporations, and our housing is arranged in a fashion in which one person controls the institutions while other people are exploited by it. So all that to say, there are contradictions, and we're definitely trying to work through them in a practical way. As for the student unions, I definitely vibe with that. Like the McGill Student Union is very similar, I think, to what you would often find in the so-called United States. Maybe a bit more oriented towards politics, but we don't form a part of. We never formed a part before it dissolved. We weren't a part of ASSE, which was sort of the anarcho-syndicalist student union, which had 70,000 members after the 2012 strikes and was organized on the basis of direct democracy, and had many committees ensuring that it took direct action, and was also an intersectional student union. We don't have that. We have people who are elected often, because they want to put it on their resume, or they think it looks good for getting into law school if they're in poli-sci. And these people have definitely, right now, I don't think there's one executive, as they're called. These are the elected people in our student union, who doesn't have some sort of accusation against them for either, acting improperly in their role, some form of sexual violence. It really is crazy. I really don't think there's one executive who hasn't had some sort of piece published about them in student media, and that's something I think we're trying to tackle, because the Anglophone universities in so-called Montreal, our student unions are very different from the ones in the Francophone, and that's sort of why we talk a bit about creating an insurrectionary campus, because things that would just never pass in some Francophone universities pass here at McGill, like the security having a really wide purview of where it can go. There's security cameras everywhere. I know a few years ago, a friend was telling me at UQAM, the administration tried to install security cameras and everyone just smashed the hell out of them. And the walls, if you go to UQAM, are spray painted all over. And there is just very much, and they go on strike all the time. They're notorious for having just a combative syndicalism, compared to what you have at McGill, which I think is very akin to what you would see in the U.S.
Is there an issue there of tuition? Is that something that people are fighting about as well? Because in the U.S., that's definitely kind of the trajectory that campuses are just becoming more and more expensive.
No, not really. I mean, here, it's $2,700 to go to school for a semester, which is still huge. But it's not taking the prominence right now, I think, in the student movement that it does in the U.S. for, I think, sort of obvious reasons. Also, it just hasn't been a conversation at McGill for a while, and from my understanding, I could be very mistaken here, just because we really haven't been looking into it, despite feeling connected to 2012. I understand it's more of a provincial thing, rather than something the university itself could control so much. So the prospects of us taking direct action and seeing immediate gains are a little lower if we're not a huge movement for things like tuition.
Well, where do you see this thing going in the coming days and weeks?
We definitely have some things planned, and hopefully things escalate, and we don't just have tents here. Going to try to push what we're doing so that we make as many gains as possible, and that it's not especially I think at McGill there's sort of this idea that everyone's in it for like a career. Everyone's going to McGill because it's like the Harvard of Canada, as it like likes to frame itself. And everyone's training for the professional class. But doing this occupation, we've had like a lot of anarchists come from like all over McGill who just thought everyone else was a robot who went to the school, and some people involved in like squatters movements, some people involved in BLM, Hong Kong. So I think like showing people that like there are a set of people who are willing to defy in pretty radical ways. It will probably be where we go in the coming days. Other than that, like just like making sure we have good care practices, because like this has definitely been like I think a really tiring experience for a lot of our activists. Like we've been some people have been sleeping there almost every day, and that's like we're like sleeping in a hallway, and we like live in the hallway, and we definitely have cabin fever a bit, and there's like a bit of tension I think that can grow sometimes out of those kinds of spaces. So yeah, just like taking better care of ourselves is a discussion we've had, like people taking breaks, better rotation of tasks. We have a huge task board that's now up in the main room, so that people who are just coming in, they don't have to be involved for a while, can just like pin their name onto a task, and we know we have someone who has more capacity who will be taking that on.
Well, where can people go to find out more information about what's going on?
No, I think I'd say follow Divest McGill on Facebook and Instagram, and you'll be pretty regularly updated. Every day we do a post. We say what day of the occupation it is, and we sort of say what activities we've got going on that day, so people can look to that and get some inspiration.
Great. Well, anything else you want to talk about?
One thing I just sort of close with is like don't be afraid. Like we're trying to organize an occupation right now elsewhere with students from another university. I'd say like this thing like definitely is like doesn't take much planning if you do it in a certain way, and can just be like people bringing tents, like who've coordinated with each other into space, setting up a table, printing out zines. And just like it's a really good way to attract radicals if you don't think they exist in your campus. Great experience with direct action. Of course, like stay safe. Like I don't know how it is in the US. Like I don't want anyone having whoever, especially if there's cops on campus or anything, coming down hard on them. But it's a tactic that I think can be replicable and like has its benefits in terms of like community building, popular education, and the creation of like an insurrectionary atmosphere.
I'm Victoria Espinosa from Merced Under Construction.
Jesse Ornelas with the Central Valley Brown Berets.
We're out here to support the hunger strikers in both of our Merced County jails.
I'm out here as a formerly incarcerated person that's lived here in this county most of his life.
It's been a long time in coming. A lot of the asks that are from this current hunger strike are also asks from the 2016 hunger strike. The demands haven't been met. A lot of conditions are still poor. Folks are still, being traumatized. They lost visitation due to the pandemic for over 2 years. Medical neglect. I mean, the list goes on, and folks in there have just had enough.
It's the unwillingness of the Sheriff's Department to provide some of the most basic rehabilitative needs. For example, individuals that are locked up in this county jail here don't have access to even library books, nor do they have access to any kind of recovery services that are much needed when we're talking about, chipping away at the recidivism rate that folks on probation and parole in Mercer County go through. And it's a revolving door, here, and their inability, their unwillingness to do so is definitely a violation of some human rights.
With a lot of bail reform that have taken place, we have a lot of people getting cited and released, but you do still see the impacts of poverty on folks that are inside the jail when it comes to medical treatment and also being able to access things like the commissary and whatnot, to improve their nutrition, even though the things on there are not that great. We still see a lot of things from the 2016 hunger strike. It's problematic. Today is the 13th day of the hunger strike, and I remember when I was in Solidarity in 2016 on the hunger strike, it was 12 days and 11 nights, and the impact that had on my body as a nursing mom at the time, it was significant. I remember Jesse telling me, now you need to go to the doctor, but just knowing that they're in there and your body is going without food. A lot of things happen, about day 5, 6, it's kind of when you start to purge. You're significantly weak. It feels like by day 6, 7, you feel like you're almost at that brink where you're gonna die. Your body starts doing things. At times, organs can shut down. There's a whole list of things that happen to the human body when you're going without nourishment. And these guys were desperate enough to do this yet again because there haven't been any changes inside of the Merced County Jail, and that's all accounted for by the leadership. There's not much folks can do, but imagine just starving yourself for change. So the Sheriff's Department did do a article with the Merced Sun-Star where they allege that they're meeting some of the demands. They did not outline or stipulate as to what that was, so we actually challenged them to give us a list and be specific as to what those demands they're quote-unquote meeting. They did open up visitation finally this past weekend after over 2 years of using the pandemic as a means to prevent people from having visitation with their loved ones or any familial association. And you just see that is that what they're referring to, that they just opened up visitation? But with that visitation being open, now there's more preventative measures. If folks don't choose to get vaccinated themselves or the loved ones, they can't come and see them. And people should have a right to choose what they want to put in their body. And then also now the new visitation rules state that any children under the age of 5 are not allowed to come into the facility for visitation. So right now it's just basically calling on the administration, and we're gonna have to call on outside entities to do a thorough investigation, because we think about it, it's almost 6 years since the 2016 hunger strike, and many of these demands are the same ones from 2016, and yet they have not done many things to change what's going on. The black mold, we just spoke to a gentleman that was here a moment ago that was here from 2016, 2019 inside of the Merced County Jail, and he stated that he just had sinus surgery. You don't understand what black mold does to the human body. It could cause cancer, underlying health conditions. It suppresses your immune system, makes you more susceptible to other diseases, including COVID. So the fact that people are still suffering in there from the detrimental effects of that, and then the lack of medical care, the lack of proper nutrition, not being given hot meals, and not having access to familial association. We're 6 years almost in the making, and we haven't seen much change at all.
The conditions in here are bad. As somebody that was here last 13 years ago, you're only getting yard time 2 hours a week. So that's like, you don't get access to sunlight, you don't get access to fresh air. At the same time, these individuals are sacrificing their bodies for a cause. So we're talking about sensory deprivation, and then we're also talking about food deprivation at the same time. The impacts of that on them is concerning for me. I'm hoping that the administration here, including the Merced County Board of Supervisors, takes the needs of the prisoners and the needs of the families into serious consideration. A big reason why we don't see a lot of the family members here is because some of the prisoners participating in hunger strikes have been deemed too dangerous or been hit with gang enhancements, and therefore if you see people advocating for alleged gang members, it puts them in harm for being connected to them. The Merced Police Department, the Merced County Probation, and all law enforcement entities still use a gang injunction type metrics when connecting people to gangs. And so it's important that people that aren't connected to people inside come out. Back in the day, schools provided reading, writing, and arithmetic, but now in 2022, schools need to provide food pantries. They need to provide a lot more things besides education. And so I kind of see the jail systems, local jail systems, as the same way, and they need to be pretty much have more of a wraparound service for the people that visit their facilities. That includes wellness. That includes wellness services for everybody, not just those prisoners that they deem safe. We're talking about drug treatment. We're talking about healthy food, and including consistent visitation with families is definitely a priority. And so I think and how counties are incarcerating individuals needs to shift, needs to pivot just to get with the societal needs. At the end of it, when the basic needs of prisoners are met, the communities become healthier.
Όσο κλείνουν τα σύνορα, ανάρκες και όπλα και αμέτρητα θύματα. Τόσες ψυχές που καθήκαν τα κύματα, ενώ κυβερνήσεις βουλιάζουν στα χρήματα. Υπογραφές χωρίς ενοχές, την τρομοκρατία ψάξε βρες στις αρχές. Μιλιταρισμός και φανατισμός, και ο αφανισμός θα τους μοιάζει θεσμός.
Ξέρεις σαφώς ότι λάπη δεν είναι χρυσός. Λαμπερίζουν οι βόμβες του ΝΑΤΟ, νεκρός πληθυσμός. Κάνει πλόβα στρατός, χειρονύχτα. Κεφάλαιο κρατικά κόβω την πίτα. Ο πόλεμος η Ρόδο και η τάξη μας πόντια στην τσίτα. Μένουμε αντιφασιστικά, ενάντια σε πόλεμο χαρή αφεντικά.
Netter Soldat auf dem Werbeplakat, Waffen verkaufen, vermehrt Kapital. Nutzloser Geister statt Kopfbeuterei, Metallfeinde der Freiheit mit Herzen aus Stahl. Mittelmeer immer noch Massengrab, denn dieser Krieg macht Flucht. Komm, wir blockieren die Maschinerie, wo wir sind, denn der Widerstand fängt dann bei uns.
There is an army built and trained next to a door. Young faces born to make bodies hit the floor. Migrants buried deep just to feed your greed. With liquid bombs and mass bombs, there was that cheer.
The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
the war starts here. The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
let's stop it here.
Kommen zu Schulen und Messen, verteilen Kuchen zum Essen, nutzen der Jugend Interessen, zeigen auf YouTube ne Action. Ein Kamerad echter Freude für 1000 Leben, ein Mann, denn sie kämpfen ja auch dafür, dass ich dagegen sein kann.
Με θέλουνε να μένω ένα μηχάνημα και πάντα να κινούμαι μονάχα μηχανικά. Θέλουνε να γίνω μέλος και να πάρω μέρος. Οπότε το έθνος θέλει μόνο πένθος επεκτατικά. Απέναντι στον πόλεμο που πάντοτε απλώνεται να μένουμε ενωμένοι. Παραμένουμε δεμένοι μονάχα με αλληλεγγύη. Δίνω δύναμη δυναμικά.
Υψώνουν τύχη και στο χάρτη βάσουν άρκες. Πολεμάρχες εκπαιδεύουν μηχανές για να γίνουν φωνιάδες. 1-2, ένδυο βήματος ο υπηρετικό. Ενάντια στα κράτη και στο μιλιταρισμό.
There is an army built and trained next to a door. Young faces born to make bodies hit the floor. Migrants buried deep just to feed your greed. With liquid bombs and mass bombs, there was that cheer.
The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
the war starts here. The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
let's stop it here.
Bitte von weit weg,
mal wieder wird bombardiert, doch dir geht's gut. Gehst maximal bestürzt vor die Tür, denn diese Festung Europa ist ein Zentrum, darum mal weiter Wärme von dem Totschlag. Muss das hier, wenn die Bundeswehr wieder beschönigt, wer welchen sie und im Lied deutscher Zutötet und Schweren reguliert, setzt die deutsche Bestimmung nur kostümiert in voller Pracht. Krass, das Recht sind von Offizieren überrascht.
Des armes pour la paix, tout pour le progrès. Chaque moyen vous faire de plus dans ton porte-monnaie. Énorme les profits du secteur militaire. La logique capitaliste porte le fascisme dans les cœurs. Investit dans la terre, somme la terreur grandit. Fait des humanitaires en même temps des fusils. N'oublie pas les barrières, personne n'est fui. C'est la guerre, oui la guerre, elle commence ici.
Schließ dich gleich an. Im Kampf gegen Terror, Angst, es geht direkt zum Einsatz. Ins sichere Herkunftsland, zu Hause vorbereitet im BÜZ. Doch wer was verliert, sind andere Menschen. Leben, check, Bastards hier.
There is an army building paint next to a door. Young faces want to make bodies hit the floor. Migrants buried deep just to feed your greed. Liquid dumps and mass bombs, there was not here.
The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
the war starts here. The power,
Let's fight this.
the war,
Let's stop it.
the borders,
Let's break them.
let's stop it here.
All right, once again, we're back for another week. Lots to talk about, as always. We're going to talk about something that I'm sure everybody listening to this is experiencing, either when they go to put dino juice into their car or they're experiencing through like rising food prices and basic commodities and stuff like that, is that gas is really expensive. The most expensive I've seen in my lifetime. So what's behind it? Why are we seeing this? How does this relate to other stuff going on in the world? And what do we make of this? Who's benefiting from this?
Yeah, so there's two questions here, and these are questions that are often joined together. But this situation is showing how that understanding of them being fused together is fallacious, right? And those two sort of concepts being the price of oil and the price of gasoline, right? Now we assume, and the way that it's explained and the way that, you know, if you listen to NPR, you listen to like, you know, CNN when they do their kind of market wrap or whatever, they talk about these things as coupled together, right? Price of oil goes up, price of gas goes up. Now what's a little strange about that is that the gasoline that we're getting today was, you know, oil that was pumped out of the ground often multiple months ago, right? When the price of oil was different than it is today. And so they have this kind of calculation that they do, which at least in theory, if the oil companies stick to the calculation, is supposed to couple gas and oil prices together. Now, why are oil prices going up? So let's just start there. So oil prices spiked really dramatically after the invasion of Ukraine. There's a lot of reasons why. But just to kind of go over a few, one being the Black Sea is a major shipping port for oil. It is blockaded currently. You can't get ships in and out of the Black Sea, right? That cuts off a major oil shipping route, right? You have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is supposed to be pumping oil from Russia into Germany, which they killed that project off, which is going to in the future cut sort of oil import volume into Germany. There are a number of other pipelines got shut down. A number of pipelines, like natural gas pipelines got shut down. So what that all means, just to put this in perspective, Russia produces about 10% of the world's oil, which is a lot. It produces more than the United States does for sure. And it exports a lot of that oil. Now, something like 40% of the Russian government's budget is directly tied to oil profits. 40%. So when Russia sort of lies their way into, you know, murdering people in Ukraine and people get really upset about that, one of the first things that you can do to fundamentally damage the Russian government's ability to finance a war or to finance wars in the future, is to cut off their oil revenue. And so even before sanctions went into place, investors were already assuming that that's what was going to happen. Now, what's interesting about that is it was about another week or so after that sanctions around oil actually went into place. Now, I'll get back to in a second caveats there, what that means. But needless to say, people in the oil industry, the second Russian troops crossed that border, started jacking the price of oil up. And they assumed, oil prices were going to go up. OPEC, for example, announced that they were not going to increase oil production, right? And so there is a lower volume of oil in the world. Or so that's what the thinking was. Now, even before the oil sanctions went into place, because of the sanctions on Russia's access to the financial system globally, they couldn't really sell oil anyways. They couldn't ship it. They couldn't send it on airplanes. They have no way to get it anywhere. They have no way to get paid for it except to send it to China, right? And so there was this assumption there was going to be this massive drop in the global oil supply. And there has been somewhat of a drop in the global oil supply, but it wasn't nearly as severe as people thought it was going to be. And so what's happened now is you've kind of seen a course correction in oil prices. That course correction is directly proportional to how optimistic people are about peace negotiations, which as of today, recording this, still there's still no treaty, and negotiations are sort of ongoing. And so as news comes out of those negotiations, as people hear that there are points of agreement, the price of oil is dropping, because there's this sort of assumption that maybe the war is going to be over soon. So the price of oil is going down, and the price of oil is below $100 now. 3 weeks ago it was $140. So when the gas prices started going up, oil was selling for $140. Okay, per barrel. Oil prices started dropping, but gas prices kept going up. And that's what we're seeing now is we're seeing these diverging curves where gas prices are still rising, but oil prices have been falling off for the better part of a week and a half now. Right? So then we have to ask the question, if gas prices and oil prices are supposed to be coupled together, if the entire sort of loose social contract that people have with oil companies is that they're not going to gouge prices on gasoline. If those things are true, none of those things apply right now, because what's happening very obviously is a sort of profiteering. Now they'll justify this in a lot of ways, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, well there's still uncertainty. We need to like sock away money for the future, just in case there's global instability." Blah blah blah. They will give a lot of excuses, but the reality is that at this point, what they're doing is they're war profiteering. Now. I don't think it should be particularly surprising to anybody that American oil companies are war profiteering. It's kind of one of the things they do. It's sort of one of the basic building blocks of the entire line of business, is they make a lot of money on the military and they make a lot of money on wars. This is a little bit more overt than normal though. To the point where even Biden himself came out today and demanded that the gas prices go down. Because what we're seeing is we're seeing the evaporation of the sort of justification that we always get for gas prices. Now, I want to put this in proportion for people, just, proportional scale. Gas right now where I live is about $4 a gallon, right? And I live in a part of the country where gas is comparatively cheap. I'm sure it's much more expensive other places, $4.50, something like that. When I started driving, in the late 1990s, gas was 95 cents a gallon, right? Oil consumption globally hasn't gone up a factor of 4, right? Or it hasn't outpaced, oil consumption has now outpaced oil production by a factor of 4. Yeah, gas prices are 4 times as expensive as they were at that point. Oil is not 4 times as expensive. And so we can already see that there is a divergence in that structure. But we are watching at this point what can only really be considered war profiteering. I think anyone calling it other than that is naive.
It's as if this system is designed to accumulate profits at our expense.
From disasters. Oh my God.
This is a shock. When did this happen?
This is why it's so funny for Biden to come out and be like, you need to lower gas prices. Like, dude, when he was running for president, was like, I am a capitalist. Like, this is capitalism right here. Like, this literally is. I mean, the thing is like, we can't, the Milton Friedman position here is that really the oil companies are being perfect capitalists. They're being wonderful capitalists. And that's actually true. They are being great capitalists. That should tell us a lot about capitalism though. Right?
Let me throw you a curveball here. This is something very interesting, to me. Trump was well known for his associations with Saudi Arabia. I mean, the United States has been for a long time, which is, a brutal regime. I mean, I think I read some article, I saw something that they just executed like a huge amount of people over the weekend for something.
Yeah.
How has that relationship changed? Because, as we talked about on this program before, like for instance, like during some of the climate talks, they were like pushing people to like rewrite certain things so it didn't look so bad. I mean, they definitely have a stake in the continuation of, you know, fossil fuels and things like that.
Oh yeah.
How does that play out?
I mean, I'll even throw that curveball a curveball. Right after the SWIFT banking system sanctions went into place, the Biden administration sent a delegation to Venezuela. Right? Venezuela is a country which the U.S. government officially recognizes the opposition as the official government. Right? Yet they sent a government delegation to the Maduro administration, which according to the United States is not the real government. And they came away from that with a loose agreement to start at least exploring the idea of buying oil from Venezuela, right? So like, you have to keep in mind, Venezuela, Iran, and Russia were three countries that the United States very specifically uses oil as a way to sort of exert leverage against, because oil comprises a significant amount of the government budgets for those three countries. In all three cases, it's above 40%. I think in Russia, it's 40%. And then for Venezuela and Iran, it's higher than that. For the United States to go to Venezuela to try and negotiate an oil deal, which would essentially fund the Maduro regime's ability to crush the opposition completely, which is an opposition that, again, the United States recognizes as the official government of Venezuela, really tells you a lot about future oil acquisition strategy, right? Which is that they are not going to care particularly about things like domestic repression, right? They're not going to care about murdering journalists, right? Because Saudi Arabia, remember, flew an assassination team to Turkey to murder a Washington Post journalist, right? What they are going to do is they are going to care about threats to global stability, right? Like, this seems to be the paradigm that's being put in place. Now, this paradigm is very interesting because in a lot of ways, it's very, very similar to the Clinton doctrine. Not Hillary, but Bill Clinton. There's two Clinton doctrines. But Bill Clinton doctrine, which was this idea that after the end of the Cold War, we were beyond politics. Politics no longer mattered, and all major questions of human existence were solved. And so therefore, all that needed to happen was management, that they were going to manage crisis. And when hotspots popped up, they would respond to those hotspots, but otherwise try and maintain stability at all costs, right? And that means, I mean, this is very similar to the Kissinger doctrine, for example. In the way that Kissinger would put it, he would always say, I don't particularly care who the other people are, as long as the result is stability. We're watching something kind of similar playing itself out here. So we look at these regimes, you know, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, and these are regimes which have, Saudi Arabia, right? Horrendous records of domestic repression. Horrendous. I mean, even for people that, you know, might listen to this podcast that support the Maduro regime, I mean, you have to admit that there were excesses of state violence. There's no way to deny that. And increasingly people have to admit these things. Like, one of the things we're seeing, this is an aside really quick, one of the things we're seeing with the Russia conflict is a whole big solid chunk of leftists just like drifting into fantasy world in a frantic attempt to justify their position. We can't do that stuff. We have to recognize that atrocities happen in these places. But that's not what U.S. oil policy is going to be based on anymore. It's going to be based on whether or not that repressive regime is also causing forms of instability internationally that the United States does not like. Because also remember, Saudi Arabia is deeply involved in a war in Yemen right now, and the United States is supporting them in that, right? And so we are really drifting into a concept of oil policy, which is really both based on using oil as a way to enforce global stability and also basing the oil market around the dynamics of global stability as a primary category, as opposed to, say, a category of political identification or sort of long-term allyship or something like that, right? That is a shift from, I would say the Trump administration had no doctrine, at least no consistent one. But that's definitely a shift from the Obama administration, which the Obama administration was definitely working a lot more in the sort of category of human rights, or at least talking about things in that language set, whether or not they actually really had much consideration for it.
The next thing we want to bring up is this article that came out on NPR. Well, I guess it wasn't an article. It was a tweet that went pretty viral. But it was talking about, it says the White House is warning that we'll have to wind down a program that pays to test, treat, and vaccinate uninsured people for COVID-19 because the administration has run out of money for the program, which Congress failed to include in its funding legislation. So I think this is important for several reasons, and we'll go more in depth into this in a second. But as we talked about on the program the last 2 weeks, the Biden administration is sort of heralding this supposed end of the pandemic, which is ironic because, as we were talking about before we started recording, like you were saying, a major city in China was shut down over a new spike in COVID cases. I know in Germany, they're really concerned about a spike in COVID cases. People are still dying, of course, in the United States every day over COVID. So there's a worry that sort of kind of a pulling back of the restrictions is going to lead to another spike, or there's going to be perhaps even a new variant or something like that. Right here, especially this thing about basically them covering for uninsured people. Where do you think the highest concentrations of deaths from COVID are happening in the United States? It's largely in areas that are rural, that don't have access to healthcare. People are uninsured. You know, they need help, and they need testing. They need access to the vaccine. They need access to healthcare. In fact, I think this is one of the best critiques that anarchists and other anti-capitalists have laid forth is that, you know, one of the reasons that it got so bad, especially in the United States, is because, you know, we treat healthcare as a for-profit industry here, not as something that's just you need to build into a factor of everyday life within human society. And lo and behold, you know, when you throw a pandemic at it, you get a lot of people dying, and largely it's around lines of racialized class and this goes on to say another immediate impact will be an end to federal funding for monoclonal antibodies, a treatment that's been provided for free of charge. Starting next week, the White House said it will cut allocations to states by more than 30% to try to stretch out its existing supplies. And I think this is also important to mention because one of the things that they said that they would do with the pandemic sort of supposedly coming to a close and now kind of rolling into endemic, something that's just endemic within society, is that you supposedly you could go out and go to a place and get a test whenever you needed to, and they would give you a pill to take if you had COVID. So this was basically, you know, what they said they would do instead of having masks and social distancing and stuff like that. And now they're saying like, well, actually we lied. We're going to roll that back a little bit and not provide those resources for people. The NPR goes on to say government cannot buy more oral antiviral treatments like Paxlovid beyond the 20 million treatments already secured. It needs to scale back planned purchases of preventative treatments for immunocompromised people, the White House said. And they also said they're going to need to limit its push to help poorer countries vaccinate people. And this is also important for another reason, is because this medical apartheid system in which wealthier countries are hoarding vaccines is leading to situations in which poorer countries and so-called third world countries don't have access to those vaccines. And COVID is essentially running rampant in those areas. And this is where the variants are coming from, and it's spreading back across the social terrain. And of course, the state's response to that is just to militarize borders, restrict travel, push, you know, Haitian refugees into camps, which further is spreading the virus.
The Biden administration has asked for increases in things like the military budget, and no one has raised any issues about that. They have gotten economic bailout money, right? Which some of that went to us, but a lot of that went to companies, right? There wasn't really much pushback about that. they've been able to do these kind of traditional U.S. government things, these sorts of, expansions of the military, these kind of pro-capitalist kind of policies, and there's never an issue. But of course, when it comes to something like infrastructure funding or funding COVID tests, all of a sudden it's a big problem. One of the things that we've watched in the last couple of years has been this, and we talked about this a little bit, maybe a couple of weeks ago, but we've watched this really odd, strange approach by the Democrats kind of develop, which is that they kind of come forward and they make some big proposal, like Build Back Better, and they have this like press conference and there's a logo and they have an entire media campaign and blah, blah, blah. And then someone comes forward, either Joe Manchin or some Republican comes forward and says, yeah, but we won't vote for it because of like this random thing. Like, we don't like that that you're giving job training money because we don't define infrastructure as jobs, right? Which is like a silly point to make. But instead of saying, that's a really ridiculous thing to say, they go, well, maybe we can do this without considering it jobs to be infrastructure. Maybe we can just, and eventually what happens is they end up walking it back and walking it back and walking it back until the thing that ends up failing in the Senate is essentially nothing like what they started with and essentially does almost nothing. And it still fails. Yet when they want military money, it's not a problem, right? That callousness is born out of a long-standing tradition in Washington, which is to use budgets and to use programs like this, which save people's lives, as political bargaining chips. That different political parties will use these types of things, essentially as a way to engage in extortion, right? And I want to be really clear, that is what it is. On a number of levels, right? On one level, they are threatening the health and continued security of the lives of people within the United States every single time they do something like that. And they're literally playing with the conditions of our lives. That in itself is a big enough problem. I mean, this is why I'm an anarchist, right? But that in itself is a big enough problem. Why does someone in Washington, D.C., which is many hours away from my house, who has nothing in common with me, has never met me, has never been to any of the places I've ever lived, have any ability to have any say in anything that happens in my life? But yet, because of the way that, quote, representational democracy functions, we end up in this situation in which there are, quote, negotiations that happen, which sound like abstract budget line items that they're debating about, but in reality really have to do with the conditions of our lives, right? That in itself should make us so furious that the question should no longer be about whether COVID testing is getting paid for, right? We should be livid every time they do this. And it literally happens with every single budget bill. They're playing with our lives every time and doing it callously and not particularly caring about it. This has led to this approach where both sides are heavily politicizing the pandemic at this point, including the Democrats. Like, they're trying to do this thing where they're saying, oh, Republicans politicize the pandemic, blah, blah, blah. But what did they say not even a month ago? Well, they said it was over. We were going to go back to life. Everything was going to start again. And, we might have to go back into lockdown at some point, but, we don't have to wear the masks anymore. And then we can start going outside and seeing people again. And they declared the pandemic over and are now throwing a fit about not having enough tests. It does not make any logical sense. You cannot take both positions. And so Democrats are trying to do, and we said this a month ago, around a month ago, that what Biden is doing is in a lot of ways very similar to something Trump did, which is that he is giving us the rose-colored glasses view of the pandemic. I mean, I guess it's mildly different than what Trump did, which is Trump just made things up. But Biden is definitely giving us the rose-colored glasses view of what is happening here. And he's doing that in order to build political support. That, again, is playing with our lives. So here we have these people, right? So for all the people that might be listening to this that voted for Joe Biden, right? enthusiastically, not as like an act of self-defense, but enthusiastically for all those that actually supported him, right? Just keep in mind that every single time he does something like this, he's playing with your life, literally. He's playing with your job, he's playing with your income, he's playing with your taxes, he's playing with the bridges that are near your house. That's what's getting played with. That's what's being negotiated there, right? It's not just line items on a budget. It's our lives. It's where we live, and as someone who lives in a city with crumbling infrastructure, that next bridge collapse that happens probably comes at the expense of the infrastructure bill, right? And so there's like all of these very immediate, direct material effects of these kinds of things that get entirely abstracted away in these conversations in Washington, where now it's about not paying for COVID tests, but in reality, it's really about the politicization of the pandemic and how in general politicians play with our lives.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think this kind of goes back to this ongoing, defund the police debate, which, kind of as limited as it is, again, it just shows you the priorities of the system in general. As city governments across the U.S. are doubling down on funding the police and actually giving them more money, and also Biden is pushing for an expanded military budget of over $700 billion. They're basically saying we're going to invest in more war, more repression at home. We're going to cut funding for life-affirming healthcare measures, which, basically are just keeping people afloat in the current system. Yeah. So again, that really just shows the way that they view how they're going to keep society together and from crumbling apart is they're just going to basically throw more police at it, which is what, neoliberalism has done, since the 1970s. It's just thrown more and more police at people, thrown more and more people into prisons, and that's the way they're going to basically keep society functioning as things continue to unravel.
Yep, freedom and capitalism right there. I mean, literally. I mean, Milton Friedman himself, who wrote a book called Capitalism and Freedom, when he was involved in the sort of post-Pinochet coup restructuring of the Chilean economy, said things like, yeah, I mean, sometimes we just really like authoritarians because they keep things nice and stable, right? These are the people that all of these right-wing Americans sit there and claim are political theorists of human autonomy. It's absurd, right? I mean, we're watching in a lot of ways. I mean, what's happening with things like COVID funding in this case, or even in a lot of ways, what's happening with sort of the international niceties around the war in Ukraine is there are these kind of normative ways of doing things that have sort of existed within governmental structures, right? And some of those things are kind of ceremonial, like they involve ceremony. Some of those things are based in kind of norms, like the filibuster, for example. Some of those things are grounded in sort of expectation, right? But what we're seeing here, just like in the war in Ukraine, the Russians staged 190,000 troops on the border for a year, almost, and then couldn't just leave at that point. I mean, this is like the thinking, right? In foreign policy, they couldn't just leave at that point because, well, at that point, it would look really weak. So then they were stuck invading, right? Now they can't leave. It's this really absurd situation in which this sort of discussion happens on this abstract level of political hierarchy, right? Like discussion rooms at the UN or debate rooms in Congress. And none of us have anything to do with that world at all. Except sometimes what happens in that world results in bombs getting dropped on your house, or results in you losing your healthcare access, or results in your job going away, or results in your taxes going up to a rate that's unsustainable, right? That wasn't anything we were involved in discussing. It wasn't anything we were involved in having anything to do with. Yet we have to listen. We have to abide by it. Because if we don't, people in blue uniforms with guns kick our doors down and arrest us for not paying taxes or not listening to cops or whatever, right? That is extortion. That is extortion. There's no other real way to think about it. It is extortion. And it's extortion that at the end of the day, we end up being on the receiving end of the tragic results of, right? We end up, unfortunately, being a person stuck in a war zone, having to fight their way out, having to fight invaders to save your house, or we end up on the streets. in a city that decided that it was more important to fund the police than to build another shelter for people that don't have housing, right? Or we end up dying of COVID without knowing that it's COVID because we can't get tested anywhere. Like, that is the world that the normativity of the American political system is creating, right? That really, you know, Hannah Arendt has a whole thing about the banality of evil, like this whole argument about the banality of evil. But I would even say it's more than that. It's about the tragedy of normativity. That what we're watching with something like this COVID bill, or even the infrastructure bill in a lot of ways, is predictable. You could almost write the script ahead of time. It's playing out along predictable lines that are spectacularly banal, right? But the effects of that are not. And this is, you know, we were talking about this again with the war in Ukraine before we started recording, but this is another example of this. You know, in the war in Ukraine, we have this situation in which Russian military aggression and sort of NATO foreign policy interests collided in this way. And the people that lose are the people that have to survive it. The people that are being invaded, that are having their towns taken over, that are having their houses taken over, that are having their schools blown up and their hospitals blown up, right? And are being forced to fight. People who were, you know, doctors, nurses, clerks at a convenience store, and now they're fighters, right? It's something no one should have to go through. It's not like the lead up to that conflict had this kind of white hot heat to it. It's not like there was this, like, you know, clear form of linear escalation that led to this. It's not. It was more like the war in Iraq. It was like there was this buildup and this sending of signals back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then eventually the signals added up and an invasion happened. But it's not like there was any sort of immediate action preceding that was any different from what was happening before, right? And the artifice of that situation becomes really obvious in cases like this, right? I mean, this is why, you know, as we were talking about earlier before we started recording, anarchists are really the ones with the right position in this whole question about Ukraine, and that, like, what are we doing? We're supporting the people in Ukraine, right? We could really care less about the governments, but we're supporting people in Ukraine, right? Now here, what we watched happen is we watched the sort of normative process of a budget debate result in funding for COVID testing getting yanked, funding for really essential therapies that are given to people in intensive care getting yanked, right? We're watching a result which will result in the death of a significant number of people because of lack of treatment, lack of testing, right? And that decision was made, let me put it this way, that decision was not made. It was just the result of the failure to make a different one, right? It was just an outcome of the political system like anything else, and the people who were involved in that discussion felt almost no emotion about it, just like they would feel emotion about funding a road. But yeah, here we are on the receiving end of that, right? You know, people ask me, like, why I spent a lot of my life doing this kind of work. This is why, right here. Like, you're seeing it right now. This is why. This is why. We shouldn't have to live in a world like that, where a bunch of bureaucratic processes and forms of polite normativity result in people dying on the side of the road because of a lack of medical care or a war happening. These are things we should all be furious about. And I think increasingly people are. Ultimately, though, we have to do something with that anger, right? That's really where the question comes in. That's really where all of these questions of organization, all these questions of revolt, all of these questions of mutual aid, all of these projects we do, all of these communities that we support, all of that. This is where all of that becomes super, super relevant, because to resist something like this is very specifically not to ask for politicians to do something, but is to ask them to get out of the way, right? Until we do that, we're going to be on the receiving end of things like this, just like we have been in the past.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us, and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.